conversation with me, we're going to do quite a lot of co-creating in the room in this session, and I'm very grateful for your participation. My name's Angela, and as a two, I'm very happy about how pleased Dirk is going to be with me because we are going to cover art, science, and consciousness all in one presentation. And we'll begin with some expression of the art relative to our interest this morning. We'll use storytelling and poetry. We'll also dip our toes a little, because we must, into science this morning. But really, I will out myself from the start to say that my deep interest is in the consciousness piece. And so much of the meaning of my relationship to paradox comes out of desire for enhanced consciousness. And the incredible gift and tool that paradox is in the journey past where dual thinking takes us. But I must confess that the Enneagram was introduced to me at least 10 years ago now. One of my clients is Joni Petty. Some of you may know Joni's run the Enneagram Institute in South Africa, and I was her coach, and she told me about the Enneagram, and I rejected it and judged it mightily right away. To me, any profiling tool that had the audacity to define someone or box them or try to predict responses or childhood experiences was not something that I, as a more whole, more spiritually orientated teacher, was ever going to accept. And so there was one mighty judgment and rejection, and the Enneagram continued to introduce itself to me and flirt for years afterwards. It just came up everywhere I went, despite my best efforts to resist, which I did very powerfully with all the superiority that the two can muster. 10 years later, I find myself in my corporate expression as the head of Enneagram for a leadership development organization. There is not a single client engagement that I work with that doesn't include the Enneagram in my professional expression these days, not one. In my private practice for the last 3 years, one of the most popular offerings has been my couples Enneagram work, how we look at the space between two profiles. In my own spiritual journey that has included a variety of faces and expressions, the Enneagram even arrives in my own experiences with plant medicines, unbidden, I can tell you. And in the deepest part of my work at the moment, which is in meditation, I find myself thankful to the Enneagram for helping me navigate some of the most subtle expressions of resistance to the collapse of the self that I run into in those very, very deep connected spaces. There's very little language available to us when we are at that junction between one expression of the I, as we heard from Dirk yesterday, and then the collapse of the I. And to navigate that abyss is a radical enough ask as it is. And without the Enneagram to assist in my own and with my clients' understandings of the incredibly subtle ways in which we want to hold on and grip to identity, I'm not sure that I'd have been able to hold those meditation practices quite as powerfully. But perhaps the most obvious indication of the degree to which the Enneagram has inserted itself in my life is what went down in a family long weekend with some friends in the Karoo this Easter. Two families spending time together, lots of children, lots of board games, lots of organizing. I'm sure you know the story. And on the Saturday evening, at the height of thinking about entertainment and how the families were getting on and sorting out the food, my 14-year-old son asked if he could speak to me in the room and said to me straight, "Mom, your two is going way too crazy and we have to do something about that." He then laid out every single example of how overconsideration was getting in the way of other people's fun. He was absolutely right. But when your 14-year-old son gives you that kind of precise feedback in that language, then you know that the Enneagram has inserted itself into every single expression of your life. So if I were to put a metaphor or a story to my relationship with the Enneagram, I would probably describe it as that. Because for 10 years, only the Enneagram had the interest, and I rejected it, and now codependency actually might even be a better way to describe it. So by way of check-in, and also to invoke story, and also to honor for a moment the subjective experience, because one of the paradoxes that we encounter when we are muddling our way through the aspect of consciousness is that if we try to deny that dual thinking, ego, in Dirk's language yesterday, it was that small I. If we deny that subjectivity, it only holds on tighter and doesn't, in fact, allow the release of it. So we'll begin today in a very subjective storytelling way. And just to share with 4 people, so if you could group yourself in 4, and share with each other, what is your story with the Enneagram? Are you right in the early stages of this experience? Is it just flirtation? And see, over and above just the relaying of the history, see if you can stretch out of the sharing of facts into either a metaphor or an archetype or some form of turning your relationship with the Enneagram into a creative artifact of sorts, such as from unrequited love to all over each other, but in your own expression. So just in groups of 4, what is your story with the Enneagram? red wine one night, that I suspect the Enneagram is a real life, breathing, living creature, a teacher, because my experience with it has been similar to my experience with the other deep teachers in my life. First I reject them, then I go in a little bit, then I know everything straight away, then I don't know anything after a while. And that dynamic, deepening, humbling relationship can be there with a teacher, certainly there for me with the Enneagram. So we are all, as we know, telling stories and making and giving meaning. We're not really meaning seekers, we're meaning makers as human beings. And one of the big collective stories that we've told for a long time developed because of our understanding of the Newtonian model of reality. My matric science teacher would be turning in his grave if he knew that I was attempting to share some scientific concepts. But the benefit of actually thinking through science from someone not skilled in that area is that we can make it very simple and only relevant to what we need it for. So my fascination with learning about quantum physics is actually not because of a great appreciation or skill in science, but of my own, but because of its remarkable openings for consciousness and for giving us an alternative schema, let's call it, for recognizing and naming the self and some of the properties of the self that the mystics and the poets have been talking of for a long time, but which Newtonian and even Descartesian influence makes incredibly difficult for us to reconcile. So what is by now very understood and accepted is that we have been viewing our existence through a lens that largely up till now has been formed for us through the Newtonian model of reality. And that has developed a strong capacity for dual thinking. I suspect we've needed that capacity along the way. It's not something that I would demonize or try to eviscerate or judge, because the moment we're relating to it that way, we're firmly inside the dual model all over again. But it's useful to be curious about what unquestioned truths that model of being, of reality, has instilled in our operating system up till now. So some of the qualities that we know have been developed in us from that model are the categorizing, distinguishing, separating abilities we have and interests we have as human beings. So things are this or they are that. They do that or they do this. You are that and I am this. Again, not wrong, but a strong framework that allows us only to see within a limited tunnel of truth. Another hangover, let's call it, from dualistic thinking is the absolutely unquestioned, you still get this in the educational environment, the unquestioned idea that if you're in contradiction, your thinking is faulty. So that the moment you hit a contradiction, and those of you who have an interest in poetry like I do will know that we have a lovely challenge to this idea from Walt Whitman and William Wallace, a number of Latin American poets, but they were challenging this idea that if I feel like a contradiction, or if my way of seeing something is contradictory, it therefore is faulty. And a lot of the ways in which we still try to make sense of the world still pay homage to that. And then primarily, what that, and I know paradigm is such an 80s word, but it is such a good word to explain what I'm trying to portray here. That this is a paradigm. It's a way of entering into your existence. It's not necessarily the truth of existence. It's a way of experiencing it. And very much dualistic thinking is based on a mechanical model. In other words, there are parts of the whole, and then there's the sum of the whole, and the parts all play a little role, and they do their own thing, and the whole is something else. And then also, something we most of us, I suspect, still live as truth is that this action creates that result. Sometimes that may be true, but let's just step back for a minute and name that that paradigm is a mechanical, dualistic, Newtonian approach. That when you say, I know that this cause will create that effect, we're in this bucket of sense making. And again, there may well be times when utilizing this framework gives us precisely what we're looking for. But what I want to ask you now is, what do you see in our world? Consider the world a mirror of our own truth. Consider the world as it is now a mirror of the collective truth that human beings have been telling about who we are. What do you see in the world that shows us that this is the model that we've been using and that you don't enjoy? Or what problems or suffering can you see that this might have caused? For us or individually, if you can recognize that too. Going down this path of sense making, what has it meant? Where has it got us?
War, for starters.
Okay, can you unpack, Renata?
Well, if this is right and that's wrong, we fight wars over it.
Sure. Or you are not me as a primary ground for war. Absolutely. What else?
Organisational structures in a business.
You unpack it me?
This is your job, and that's my job. And
Yes.
I'll do this and you do that. So separation as opposed to cooperation.
Sure. So the way we set up your job description, your remuneration, your recruitment process is based on individual. Now we'd like you to collaborate, please, and operate in a complex, agile, self-sustaining way. But we never set it up like that. Absolutely. So organizational expression, a characteristic of dual thinking. What else?
The education system, wrong, right,
Yes.
black, white, nothing in between.
Right. Education system, beautiful. There are obviously some shifts in these areas. I'm not suggesting that there are no expressions of a non-dual frame in any of these areas, but by and large, yeah. And primarily, the one I'm wondering about.
Disassociation from our environment, including our bodies.
Totally. So the presumption that we are not the environment in which we live, that it is something and we are not that, is, and we are seeing the results of that understanding, and then definitely in the area of relationship to body. the split out of mind and emotion from physiology. I mean, it's actually by now, it's laughable when we think we did that. It's quite comical. But nonetheless, we are still sitting with ideas about healthcare, about medicine, even about food, that reflect that there's something distinct or disconnected between our physiologies and the state we're in. Right, we know better, but nonetheless, it is quite, or has been for me, in the simultaneous deep experience of essence that has been certainly, I would say, my primary interest in life. And then at the same time in my lifetime, the questioning and challenging of this model, not from the mystics, but now also from the scientists. So a quick question, I'm just looking for a few thoughts, some of you may already be going there. In terms of how we enter into and use the Enneagram, what does it look like when we're coming from this paradigm into the Enneagram? How would we work with it and serve with it if this is our schema? Thank you, Jerry, for a lovely word.
Well, I can see how it could be misused, because just thinking about how some people could use it as the boxing, you know, the right, wrong, it is or it isn't, which could be really dangerous or devastating.
For sure.
Yeah, very, to follow on, like very compartmentalizing, not fluid at all, not integrated, very boxy and limiting. Incredibly limiting, especially within an organization where they're innate, religious, too, and without any, openness for the change and the integration, the deeper understanding of what the possibilities are within the Enneagram.
For sure, and I'm sure you've seen it does get used like that at times. Sure. Also, you are this and I'm not. Is a reflection of that, or I am only this, and so the disconnected expression or use of the Enneagram. And we'll get a little bit more subtle about that as we go. And so the understanding of a model of reality that is not mechanical has quite blown the minds of many people that enjoy thinking on that kind of meta level. Because what is it that the quantum model suggests? Firstly, that everything, including us, is both particle and wave. So we are matter and we are not. We are localized and we are non-local. When Dirk spoke in the introduction yesterday about Claudio challenging them, and my own spiritual teacher does the same, challenging them, I'm going to do that just for fun to you guys at the end of the session too, to move from convergent thinking or I am this to spaciousness. That is when we start to challenge the identity of ourselves as localized only. And it is a very big stretch for certain parts of our brain to leave that individualized, localized state of self. But when we do, we recognize this truth is profound and creates for us possibilities that are frankly quite mind-blowing. everything, including us, exhibits properties of both particle and wave. So we are bedded down in space and time, and we are not. Secondly, the other extraordinary and amazing truth that quantum physics has brought us is that there is no such thing as an objective impartial observer, and so observation creates experience, not simply witnesses it. There is no disconnect or compartmentalization between what is being observed and the energy that is doing the observing. And that threw into disrepute almost all of the scientific method that was practiced before it, where we thought we were working with an objective set of observers recording data. We now know that the way they see the data and even how the data develops is based on the energy that the observer brings to the experience. For us as human beings, where does that leave us anew and afresh in our relationship with the world? What are we no longer, if you take that as true? Totally. And victims. You can't be if you recognize that the state of observation you are bringing is, I would go as far as saying causing the experience, but let's be a little more conservative and say co-creating the experience. The end of Jerry's talk speaks to this, doesn't it? In the sense that you come into the room with the setup in your own energy field. And so my experience of Carl is a completely different human being from your experience of Carl, because it is not objective. The observer affects the experience deeply. This is old hat by now, okay? We know distance and time are perceptions. They can be valuable perceptions. They allow us to explore Khalid's journey from unity to multiplicity and back. We can't play that game if we don't buy in, at least for a while, to time and space. So again, not wrong, but let's at least observe the new frames that quantum physics brings us. Sorry, that's not working. You know, when it's time to sign into HubSpot, then everything else must stop. And then entanglement. Entanglement, which we know is true of particles, suggests that once a bond is formed, it can never be unformed, and the experience of one part of that bond is going to influence instantaneously, so no time and space involved, what goes on with the other party. Quantum entanglement is what it's called. And so these are the meta understandings. And the same question I'm going to ask you relative to dualistic thinking. What do you think this looks like for us in our daily life, in the way we understand death, in the way we teach, relate, and so on? Can you see anything that might be radically different because of this lens? What are the implications, Lynn?
Often it says in things like this, nothing that's absolute. Everything depends on experience and perception of the other and then estimation. So you'll have multiple experiences and multiple expressions of what's happening. It's very
free. I'm not sure if there is anything absolute. I wouldn't be able to say that. But certainly possibilities for multiplicity enhance from this model, absolutely, and recognizing that the state or the perception of the observer is creating the phenomenon really means we can't think in our old ways anymore, for sure.
With no separation, there's no fear, so there's less fear for...
Precisely.
Practically for me, as a coach and a facilitator, I cannot pretend that I'm not part of the systems that I'm working in.
Exactly.
So I become part of the system, and I have to rather be open about that than pretend otherwise.
Precisely. So the implications of quantum thinking for us, so firstly, deeply evocative implication of quantum theory, as you suggested earlier, Lauren, is that separation isn't real. That doesn't mean deny our perception of it, and it also doesn't mean that there's no beautiful and honored place for the illusion of separation at certain levels of experience. For sure, we're not demonizing the experience of separation. We couldn't really get into this game of being human without making the mistake of believing in separation, at least for a small amount of time. We have to individuate first before we can take the journey to return to a sense where we are not separate. But nonetheless, if we're wanting to look at what quantum physics affords us as truth, that would certainly be one. This one is challenging me hugely in my work and in my own life at the moment. We have just taken it as truth that progress or unfoldment comes from actions. That is what it looks like, it's what we were taught. It's a long conversation about where that's led us, but all I want to suggest for your consideration is that in fact unfoldment, in other words, what happens, is energy-based or state-based as opposed to action-based. So the mechanical model says, okay, if you eat this and not that, then this will be the result. You will look like this, you will not get cancer, this will be the outcome. That's an action-based approach to something. The energy-based model would suggest that the state in which you are doing that eating is at the very least going to co-affect the outcome than simply the action. It's actually so obvious, the truth of this, when you look at the world and you realize that not everybody who eats like that avoids cancer and looks that way, and so, but we still want to insist that we can figure out being human through an action-based dimension of thought. But in fact, the possibilities from an energy-based approach, or state-based, or observer-based, you can use all of those, whatever feels right to you, is very freeing, your word, Lynn. And then the inner world produces the outer, and not the other way around. This is, of course, the paradigm afforded to us, we're invited into from our mystics since the beginning of time. But it's borne out now, beginning to be borne out by the quantum physics model, and it changes everything. So again, the question, when we dance with the Enneagram through some of these frameworks, what can that look like? How might it be different from entering into the Enneagram through dual thinking. Wholeness is a big one. An aim of wholeness as opposed to virtuousness is a very, very different lens through which to work with the Enneagram or any other human development process. Are we aiming to become these things and not these? That's often how we enter into human development work. Or are we interested in uncovering wholeness? That's one big deal.
We can bring more attention to our states of being versus our cognitive patterns.
Totally. So as Richard said earlier, one of the implications of this is that the way we as practitioners go into the conversation, we are not objective observers, and equally the state in which someone is receiving the Enneagram is as important, at least as important as giving them new actions to take. Okay? Because if the internal quality of their own ability to observe their life doesn't change, it doesn't matter how good you are at getting new behaviors, in my opinion. They may change things cosmetically, but not sustainably, and not in any deep transformative way. So, certainly there are new possibilities on every level if we start to challenge our belief in a mechanistic, Newtonian, duality-based view of existence. Right, so let's establish that. But how do we do that? We will play at the end of our time together today with meditation experience. It's going to be quite long, so I would not judge anyone who wants to leave at this point. But certainly I do not know of a more effective technology for transcending a very embedded way of thinking than actually exiting the thinking process altogether instead of trying to think our way into new thinking forms. So certainly in my experience, the most powerful way to upgrade the operating system, that's a term you've heard already, is to observe that there is an operating system and that you are not it. And so that is the job of meditation. And we'll have a bit of an experience of that. But another magnificent opportunity that we do have, and this is more in the cognitive realm, is what happens when we run into a paradox in our lives or with our clients, and in particular, and that's the work we're going to do in a minute, inside our Enneagram type. Why is this? I know it's hard. So paradox it's rough. It looks like you've come to the end of the road. It looks like there's no more work that can be done here. That's what it seems like when we hit up against the paradox. But why actually is that so exciting to have got there? Because what have we come to the end of when we've hit a paradox? Totally. Your dual way of making sense of the world has run out now. When you hit a paradox, and as you sit there, the invitation is into non-dual thinking. That's what a paradox brings us. So I get quite, as you can see, quite viscerally excited when my clients tell me, I've hit a terrible paradox, because now what has happened is you've reached the limits of that way of thinking, and now there's something new, really new, that is possible. It's a similar principle that some teachers in the East use when they employ the koan as a teaching mechanism. Do you know the mechanism of a koan? I'm sure, Khaled, you know this better than me. It's an unsolvable statement or riddle or question. And how the masters would use it would be to welcome in all these eager students who want to attain enlightenment and are very, very sincere and eager and want to work hard. And they come in the room, sit down, he'll write a koan on the board and leave 4 days. And then the wrestling begins. Because you can feel from your, you used the word heart, Khaled. We don't mean heart in the sense of your emotional center. We mean more along the lines of essence. These words are all wrong. But something along those, something in you senses that there is a point to the koan. And so you stay with it. But if you are employing any form of separation thinking, you can't open the door to it until you do, because you run out of capacity in that mechanistic, linear, rational mind. It's beautiful. It's got a lovely function. It's beautiful as a servant and terrible as a master. And when we get to the end of it, we are usually in the domain of paradox. The Enneagram has been one of the most beautiful offerers of paradox. So what would be deeply beneficial is for us to dive into the heart of each type's paradox. And please don't just kind of put forward the triggers or the fear in their academic forms. I'd really like you to feel into the core paradox at the heart of each type. And I'll give some helpful steers for this. I'm going to invite you to work into whatever type you'd like to. If it's your own dominant one, sure, but you might actually be engaging with another point on the Enneagram in your life right now that you are deeply befriending or that you're very resistant to. So feel free to organize yourself on your own preferences, not necessarily through your dominant type if you don't want to. And what we're going to set up is a conversation between 1s, 2s, 3s in that area, 4s, 5s, 6s over there, 7s, 8s, and 9s. So please move to where you'd like to have the conversation, starting with 1 and all the way around to 9. That we can go to with paradox instead of just rehashing what we know about the Enneagram. I share perhaps one of the most exquisite attempts to explain, these words are actually really inadequate, but enlightenment or the journey from multiplicity back to unity. Falling in love with the divine is how Rumi himself would have named it. Collapsing separation, really. Let's leave it at that. So here the paradoxes invoked in this journey. Be helpless, dumbfounded, unable to say yes or no. Then a stretcher will come from grace to gather us up. We are too dull-eyed to see that beauty. If we say we can, we're lying. If we say no, we don't see it, that no will behead us and shut tight our window onto spirit. So, let us rather not be sure of anything beside ourselves and only that. So miraculous beings come running to help. Crazed, lying in a zero circle, mute, we shall be saying, finally with tremendous eloquence, lead us. When we have totally surrendered to that beauty, we shall be a mighty kind voice. This is the language of paradox that takes us past a separation thinking. What are the paradoxes we see here? Just briefly. We surrender and then we're mighty. If we say yes, it's over. If we say no, it's over. If we know we can see the beauty of the divine, it's gone. If we say I can't see the beauty of the divine, it's gone. Zero circle. No points of distinction or separation or polarity along that. So with that in mind, let's work into, and this can be quite emotive actually, what your sense is of the paradox that is at the core of the type that you are working in. If you're struggling to access that, some questions that might help, ideas or positions that feel like deep contradictions or opposites, that's one way. Where does the thinking start looping in this type you're working in? Where does it start going in a self-fulfilling loop? I really sound like a 4 on this slide, but I really mean, what is the deep, deep suffering? Where is that located for this type? You're going to come close to your paradox that. What is your type or this type set up as the enemy of its core motivation, its core reason for being? That's another way to access this. And I've heard this from my clients often, what they're actually naming their paradox, but the way they phrase it is, I just can't make peace with, or I just can't be okay with. One of the most poignant examples of this has been for me being in a coaching relationship with a type 5 client for a long time. And in the process of that relationship, she lost her mom in quite an unexpected and fairly inexplicable way. She's still grieving 3 years later because she can't understand that death. And so her rational mind, or her way of engaging with this experience has run out. It's too paradoxical for her. And so she's pulling back again in your framing, Colette, turning out of the circle instead of turning in. So instead of looking at understanding, or the need for understanding as the barrier, she's looping back into trying to understand all the time and staying deeply stuck in a grieving. I always, my presumption, this is incorrect, but my presumption was always that the difficulties my type 5 beloveds would have was in the head, primarily. But this is a grieving process that nonetheless has been deeply hamstrung by the setting up, in her case, faith as the enemy to understanding. And so she's stuck. You certainly don't feel obliged to answer all these questions. If your conversation goes in another organic way, but you're still feeling like you're getting to the heart of the paradox of each type, please let that flow. But to assist, these are here. I'm going to write these up so that we actually start generating some of this knowledge. I haven't yet seen quite complete literature on this yet, at this depth, so I'm hoping that we're part of the creators of that. Right, so at least 20 minutes, maybe even, 20 minutes. left, and what I would like to most focus that on, is using the learning from this conversation to challenge ourselves into a quantum relationship with your type instead of a relationship that comes from a dual or separation-based mindset. For me, that is where the Enneagram springs into living, breathing gift. And so I'll call on the twos first to share their experience of that. We're just taking brief comments, and then I want to have a look at what that might be for each type. But to give you an example that has caused me, and really suffering is not too exaggerated a word, and the decade is not too exaggerated a time frame, and that is my attempts to finish my book. Arguably, the completing a book would be one of the greater acts of service that I could do, and as a two, instinctively I just know, I feel that service is joy. So that's there, I see that. But to become unavailable to my family or my clients in the kind of way that is required so that I can write my book, I can't. So I am jeopardizing my deep service because of my insistence on giving, helping, availability, and caring in that small separation consciousness way. And there's the paradox. So I, in a way that maybe no other type would do, am actually threatening my biggest gift. I'm willing to compromise something very core to me because I've got into a relationship with my gift that is based on separation consciousness instead of wholeness. Because if I was whole, if I had a quantum relationship to my type, what would be available? There's something more core here, and it's to do with identity and self, besides actions. I can't take those actions. I know I should, but in my current mode of thinking, I cannot do that unless I altogether collapse the paradox that I've gotten myself into, and I'm engaging from a whole other level of identity. Was that a similar, I'll come to the soul in a minute. Was that a similar conundrum for some of the other twos? What were your polarities? Where did you run into suffering?
So the paradox, I felt like what I said was the paradox seems for us to lie in that we hold, the structure holds a belief there's not enough love, so we have to be that love in the world. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, we overdo it to make up for the belief.
And does that produce more love?
No, hold on, I've finished it. And then the paradox is we experience a reality. It's an illusion, but we experience a reality of not enough love. So we've pushed people away. They don't give us the feedback, all this sort of thing. So it's the paradox of holding a belief there's not enough creates a behaviour of overdoing, and then a reality of not enough. If we can drop into the reality that we are the one love, what we were saying is it's almost as twos, we're almost the closest to being those channels of unconditional giving. That's like our essence. So if we can drop into that, we have the pleasure of the beauty of giving, and there's no expectation of anything, so we just reside in that flow where it naturally there's enough for everyone, and it comes beautifully. So it's when we're stuck in structure that we come up with a cropper, if you like.
Beautiful. That's beautifully articulated as what we cannot avoid getting stuck in if we are thinking about our existence as separate. We can't avoid it. There's no way to get unstuck even if you force behavioral change. You'll just loop in other ways. So what Bernadette expresses for us is that something about our identity, truth of self shifts to unlock or collapse the paradox that otherwise we will unavoidably loop into. And so it's a tiny distortion we make, tiny on a semantic level, but on a consequential level, enormous when we just have distorted our relationship with our type away from the quantum understanding of it and expressing of it and enjoying of it into the dualistic relationship with our type, okay, where the suffering is steep. And so for twos, instead of the quantum-based, I am a bit fast and loose with the term quantum, I know, but it's fun and it's not inaccurate. If we understand quantum to be non-separate, the non-separate identity then of the two, exactly as you put it, you used the same terminology yesterday, Khaled, is I am love. Not I in the little ego form of I, the I am as in the essence expression. It is love, if you like. I do not need love. I cannot need to produce something or receive something if I am it. And there's the switch. And the paradox collapses. You remain a beautiful, glorious, contributing spark of the divine through that doorway, but in an entirely different relationship with that gift. As if you are simply the living expression of what is anyway, and that you do not need it, that switch. So for the one, instead of I need to make things perfect, the quantum relationship would be I am an expression of perfection. It's not again in the ego sense. I'm presuming we're way past that understanding here. I am the divine reflection of perfection. It is perfect, even in its faultiness, even in its flaws. And so I do not require perfection. Nonetheless, I'm so attuned to it. In Jerome's words, it's my intuitive edge. And so I will bring even more of it to the whole. But if I require it, I bring less. And I, in fact, jeopardize the very thing, as you were putting it earlier, the very thing that I love the most, I jeopardize if I presume I'm separate from it. For threes, what is that like? What is a quantum or non-dual relationship with self as three?
I have no word.
Yeah, you wish. But indeed. So it is done is one way of, you know how Rumi says, when you're connected to the light, you don't do anything and everything gets done. It's a paradoxical phrase yet again. That's at the heart of the three. It doesn't mean you lie on your couch all day and you manifest. It's not that. You are participating. You cannot help but embody the brilliance, but you don't seek it anymore because you cannot seek that which you experience yourself as being. We've collapsed that distance between observer and observed, and that frees us to channel, is a good word, to channel that incredible focus, efficiency, shine, But we're not in a relationship of require anymore. Because require, when you've moved into require, relative to anything, you've gone back into your dual mode of thinking. I need, or I must, or I require. You are pretending separation is real. A good type 9 example that I lived with in a very frustrating way in my own world, my husband being an SP9, was that when it came time to make the decision about where our boys would go to high school, we spent, and I'm not exaggerating, 18 months having the conversation about all these different options. And he was just asking all of our opinions and not saying anything until we took that drive between Cape Town and Johannesburg, which some of you may know goes through the Karoo. And when you're in a car with people in the Karoo between Beaufort West and Laingsburg, you can't escape. There's just nothing. And so you actually have to confront the conversation in a way you don't normally have to. And so finally, in that stretch of road, my type 9 husband eventually said, sorry to do this, but I can't be okay if the boys go to boarding school in Cape Town. It's too far. I don't want to be that far from them. Apologizing for putting his strong view in the mix. And in 30 seconds after he said that, we'd found the thing, we knew what we were going to do, we'd made the decision. We could have saved 18 months of annoying, confrontational, conflictual conversation. And so there's the paradox. In the withdrawing of that which appears to be confrontational, the 9s produce
Peace.
havoc. Havoc, really. In the insistence on all relationships being peaceful, the opportunity for genuine resolution is gone. And so the quantum relationship with a type 9 is, instead of I need things to be peaceful, will be I am peacefulness. And I am it so surely that it cannot possibly be jeopardized simply from engaging with something that is conflictual. If I am it, there is less risk, if not no risk. It's when I need it that I've slipped out of my wholeness into separation mentality. Our 5s, what does it feel like in the quantum expression of 5ness?
Did you skip 4s on purpose
No,
to make them special?
Just playing into the
This is part of the quantum field.
We hopped around. Khalid, your sense? 5?
Though we already know, because we are the voice of wisdom and knowledge,
Yes.
yet we try to think ourselves into knowing, and the more we think, the further we go away from the inner knowing that we have.
Okay, so that's the paradox beautifully expressed. Okay. So I am knowing as a present participle, excuse my English background coming out, but a continuation, a process of knowing is a much more freeing idea than I need to know. Because I need to know, I need to understand, suggests distance between myself and the divine quality of prescience, I think you called it, or all-knowing. That doesn't mean there's an insistence on me to understand everything because it's generative, it's a process. But I don't require it when I deeply recognize that I can allow it and channel it. I don't need it anymore. It's a fundamentally different relationship. know we don't have any, or we don't have any 8s in the room that were engaging as 8s, but the 8 group, what did you experience as the fascinating, and actually Rumi's poem articulated this particular paradox of the 8. What do you experience it to be? People who work with 8s. Bev, Richard.
Sure. And I'm still battling with it a little bit, but I sense that the 8s were trying so hard almost to, so obviously they're controlling, but almost the impact they have on others is almost to make sure that they're here and they're okay. But through that impact on others, they often chase those others away, and the others move away. So they end up being isolated, weak, vulnerable in the process of they were trying to make themselves strong and invulnerable.
Sure,
But
sure.
yeah,
That can happen? Sure, sure. The term surrender and mighty embedded in the Zero Circle poem was quite reflective for me of the paradox of the 8 and how mighty actually are we when we are relying on our own energy, our own ideas, our own direction, our own passion, our own momentum. And in doing that, not only are we isolating from the power of others, but also, more importantly, that expression of the divine power through us is completely blocked when we are insisting on transposing our energy on top of the world. Then we are not, in fact, allowing a far bigger, far mightier, far more effective force to move through us. And so the resistance to surrender, you can say vulnerability, the resistance to surrender or vulnerability of the 8 is precisely that, which diminishes their power and keeps it in that, I must say that, the domain of where we're just in our own isolated individual mechanical selves is quite lame. In relation to who we really are when we are full. And so the 8 wants the expression of the mighty, but precisely limits or resists that which would allow for that in its fullest form. I've seen this so much in terms of what I work a lot in leadership and which type 8 leaders seem to be the most beloved. And I use the word beloved judiciously because certain 8s in their beauty are beloved leaders. People will walk into the sea for them. They are magnetic. And those 8s, the ones that are the most beloved, can get anybody to do anything. And the reason they're beloved in the first place is because that tenderness has been shared and people relate to it, and suddenly there's even more respect, and that is what creates a magnetism in a leader that I've seldom seen expressed in any other form. So the connection of vulnerability and power, it's irresistible. And it's what 8s issue with all their might, and yet it would allow for them an opportunity for influence that isn't there otherwise. But you have to move into the quantum relationship with your type, not the separate relationship with it, to allow for that. So the risk with this work is that we slip into the understanding of the I as the ego, and then to say to the 8s, your breakthrough is going to come when you say to yourself, I am mighty, is really risky. It's not inaccurate or untrue, but you have to be deeply understanding of what we mean by the I am. And so I would want to phrase it differently around that.
There's something that's coming up to me about in the dualistic state pattern of trying to quantify the unquantifiable. So to go back to the 5, there's knowledge out there, there's a certain amount of knowledge, I don't have a high enough percentage of that knowledge. As opposed to saying, actually, particularly with knowledge, it's infinite. Because as you learn this piece, you'll create a new piece. So there's something almost maybe also in the 8 about seeing power as a finite resource that must be carved up and distributed versus power as an infinite I'm a conduit for infinite, or I'm part of something more infinite.
Infinite, part of, connected. You see, we're back in the quantum. It's the only place from which these things can be solved. We can't, you mentioned the same Einstein idea that we can't solve the problem in the same level of consciousness that created the problem. And so where the problem got created is in the separation consciousness, the way of relating to the self as separate, causes the suffering. Doesn't matter what we do, still in that frame of mind, we just loop in the suffering. So the shift, exactly that, is to recognize another truth about identity and being is possible, and then you'll still have your type, but you will express it in the I am as opposed to the I need to. It's a small semantic difference, but it is critical. Thank you. 4. How does it look for 4 in the paradox?
I was a bystander in the 4 group, and one of the images that I got very about is the paradox of truly wanting to engage in the flow of things. If we use whiteboard routing as a metaphor, we're constantly sticking there already. Wanting to move into the flow, we're constantly noticing the deepest thing, or trying to separate, or needing to differentiate when they truly actually want to be feeling part of.
Okay. So belonging and distinction, belonging and distinction. Okay, thank you.
We made you an honorary form.
Any other contribution from the 4 that wasn't covered by that?
Suffering in our longing for what all you have, and for accepting and meeting with what we have and where we are in the moment.
Okay, so is that also a present, future distinction? Like moment, you're saying moment and...
Well, it's more, it's that whole comparison and evaluation that comes back when lacking.
Okay.
And what's behind it? And what's behind it, right? Desire to contribute.
Actually, that two-ness of the okay. Yeah.
It's not just a past, it's not just a present and future, it's a past, obviously, too. It's the past, present.
Suffering being coming from the past.
That's the question, actually. Are 4s sometimes deliberately obtuse that we can't understand them?
They're just deep, Rich. They're just deep. So, of course, one of the beautiful, and I would actually love, only in this room with these equivalent geeks could I say that one of the conversations I would love to have is about the Enneagram type of Rumi. So if anyone's open over lunch to join me with that. I certainly, obviously, experience 4-ness in who his expression is towards the end of his life, but in the beginning of his life is very 1. And so that's an interesting conversation. But that, what Rumi allows is for me quite evocative of the 4 in the quantum relationship, and that is that the most ordinary of moments, of people, of emotions is so sublime, so full of the divine, so mysterious, so much part of the one, that if I were running from the mundane, I would be running from God, which is actually what the 4 knows instinctively anyway. The mystery is something very accessible to 4s, but the need for it is preventing the experience of it almost. And Rumi's life for me is actually a beautiful evocation of the shift in that degree. 6.
We had a number of examples, but the one that I think I'll bring in here is this looking for safety and certainty. So, for example, in relationships, looking for certainty in a relationship, then we will sometimes say something or do something that completely unsettles the other person, putting them on the spot, like in a big way, and then testing to see if they can handle it. And then looking for if they can handle it, then hoping that we'll trust them or finding the certainty. And then often not actually finding our relief in that, because we're looking externally. And what we should be working on is, can I trust this? Can I trust what's going on within me and what I have to offer? And so I think the paradox is a little bit in that. We're looking externally, we're testing it, and we're hoping for that perfection somewhere else. Whereas in the meantime, we should bring it home.
And in the act of that, actually destabilizing relationships.
Both the other person.
Yeah, it's a destabilizing effect to be proving and checking and questioning and doubting. And sure.
And the testing goes on forever. Even in a loyal relationship.
Right.
That's how it's lasted as long as it has, because it's been tested to destruction.
Okay. So the suffering is there. Can't afford to stop checking. Is that great? So in a quantum relationship with the 6 archetype, sure, and being is safe. But of course, to allow for that, you have to embrace death as part of being. So for me, the 6, the leap to the quantum relationship for the 6 is actually very big, takes you all the way down to the inclusion of death as part of what holds me safe in the ground of my being. It has to stretch that far with 6s. And when it does, then the 6 does not require proof of safety anymore. What they do is they channel that their own ground of being, let's call it, beautiful Sandromatry term, your ground of being. 6s get so solid in their ground of being that they can't help but create that experience, especially in teams, my word. For me, the health of a team when there's an awake 6 in the mix is just beautiful to behold. But if the need is constant there, the requirement for the proof of safety, we don't have access to the non-separate relationship with it. Great. And 7s to wrap up.
7s. We love quantum stuff. Options, no commitment. So, now the point is the following: is Pinocchio. Pinocchio said, "Oh look, my nose is growing." So is he lying? That's the paradox. So then that touched on freedom from, freedom
yes.
to.
Yes.
Then that touched on reframing, because when I have to reframe also the sensitivity from the pain for others. And then I don't know what I feel, but I can feel the pain from others, and then they reframe. So we did a funny thing in the group was someone then said, "But is that an illusion?" I said, "Give me your pinky and let me twist that." And she burst out laughing instantaneously. The point is, someone just said, "They're going to hurt me," and she started laughing. So now, is that a natural response? Is that a 7 response? Is that the type response? Is that reframing? Is that lying? Or is that quantum?
Oh, so many rabbit holes to go down. Black holes maybe also. Great. So if we pick out from that the absolutely beautiful, natural, instinctive recognition that the sevens bring us, that in our wholeness we are free. And when that is in a quantum dynamic, what does it mean we no longer have to have or need or are addicted to? Options, open doors, other. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. You'll bring them. That's who you are. But the shift we make from being in a dualistic relationship to the Enneagram to quantum relationship with the Enneagram is the split from I need to I am in its deepest, most way past the cognitive expression of the I am. I want to honor our closing time, but to share with you for your own consideration just the techniques that I use with myself and in my practice for collapsing paradox, depending on where someone is, a very, very important step in being able to collapse or really transcend paradox is to let yourself feel properly the suffering that is in there. Not just know it, but feel it, because that actually gives you the internal energy for the movement out. Feeling is unpleasant because when you're in the heart of your paradox, you've hit your suffering at its core in your type. That's not a lovely, pleasant experience, but it is a beautiful and critical experience because the feeling of the suffering provides the momentum almost for moving through it. So if we avoid that, and some of us, obviously certain types prefer not to do that, we're missing some of the tools we might have. Physically, and this is challenging, but can often the breakthrough around a paradox happens in the body when the mind just can't go there. And so that what you can do with yourselves and with your clients is to ask yourself to embody the paradoxical reality that you find yourself in, or the two things that feel like they're separate. They will appear to you as separate. And try and see if you can hold both in your own body in some form of stance. It'll be really challenging, but it can begin to step past that frontal part of the brain that's so obsessed with analyzing something rather than actually resolving and transforming it. So often the body, with certain people anyway, is a more helpful way to break through a stuckness in a paradox than the mind. But the mind we can also use, and there were lots of very helpful ways of doing this in this morning's work, was challenge yourself to seek out contrary truth than what your paradox is trying to tell you is the only way to think about something. So a beautiful way to do this, Jerry touched on this morning, is find someone else in the world who totally expresses both the things that you've put against each other. Who does, I promise you there will be people who easily step in to being and giving and living with those two things that you can't collapse. They are, so that's one way to seek out contrary truth. If you've done any of John DeMartini's work, his breakthrough process is really just that. It's taking things that you are insisting are negative and drawing out the positive, and insisting on things that are positive and drawing the negative. It's this process of just stretching out of the either-or mentality that we can get into. But beyond this, and if you wish. By far the most effective way to enter into a quantum relationship with your Enneagram type is to enter into a quantum relationship with your own being, with your own existence, with your own identity. For me, Enneagram work is identity work. And so I'll mention again, and actually it's an enormous restraint for me that I've only used the term meditation 3 times in 2 hours. Really, if I could, all I would do is use that unbelievably radical mechanic to challenge the dominance of our mechanistic thinking as a separate self. Because meditation requires you to relate to your own operating system as if it is just an operating system, and it offers an invitation into an upgrade constantly. For me, the expression of allowing our bigger consciousness to help move us from our current level of consciousness is the humility of surrendering the ego in meditation. Otherwise, pretty much all the other ways we work with ourselves are in the old operating system, trying to change the operating system. So let's close there. I recognize that this session is quite abstract in many ways, and thank you for holding the attention with as much generosity as you have.